Good morning and welcome to the next session in our series on leadership succession planning. So we're going to be covering the topic of chief executive core competencies and the leadership skills needed for tomorrow. Before we introduce our speakers today, I want to give a little bit of housekeeping. Today's webinar is being recorded, and that means that our panelists will be seen on the screen today. And that this recording will be available after the duration of the webinar. It will come to the inbox that you use to register for this forum, along with a Dropbox link that contains all of the different documents you might need to keep up with this series. This series contains 5 sessions, and we hope that you have the opportunity to digest all 5 sessions, and the content in that Dropbox link pertains to each of those sessions. If you are to need live captioning during this, please take a look at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. It should say show live captions there. And if you click that, you'll be given the option to show live captions and to resize. If you have content-related questions for our panelists today, please go ahead and plop those questions right into the Q&A box. During the forum, if you see other questions there that you like or would like to see an answer to, please go ahead and upvote those questions. That'll help me know what is a priority to cover during our Q&A session. If you have technical questions about the forum, you can't see the Q&A box, you can't see the closed captioning, you can't hear, please leave those questions in the chat box. A staff member is monitoring the chat box to answer those questions for you as they come up. Please also feel free to use the chat box to leave comments, agreements, or connect with other participants during the forum. We love to see a good conversation in there. And with that, I will go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Kerri Mollard. Kerri serves as the founder and CEO of Mollard Consulting. She's a respected authority on nonprofit board governance, planning, and fundraising. Her nonprofit career spans 27 years and includes roles in public relations, fundraising, and executive leadership. And on top of her nonprofit experience, she is also a Plain Township trustee. Kerri has a master's degree from Indiana University and a bachelor's degree from The Ohio State University. Lindsey Steinberg has been a member of Mollard Consulting since 2015. She serves as the Senior Director of Client Engagement. She has experience in nonprofit management, board governance, fundraising, and planning. Lindsey has a master's degree from Loyola University and a bachelor's degree from Miami University. And with that, I'm delighted to turn it over to our speakers today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Danielle. I'm going to share my screen here. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you for joining us on this second session, and thank you to Danielle for the introduction. And just a little bit about Mollard Consulting is that we're doing this webinar today, and Lindsey and I do all sorts of webinar and teaching, because at the end of the day, our mission is to build your capacity. We are proud and honored to serve the sector, and we hope you learn a lot today, and we hope this helps support your organization. So we're going to go to our first poll, and I will turn it over to Lindsey.
Great. So a poll will pop up here. So first thing we want to know is how long has your chief executive served in their role as chief executive? So you see the options here, and go ahead and select whichever one makes the most sense. Great. Okay, well, this is interesting. So over half of the group have been less than 5 years. And then the very far end of that spectrum, like 25 years or more, less than 5%, only one individual. So really interesting breakdown here. And when we talk about core competencies and attributes and the job description itself, the length of time, can impact how recently it was updated and what that looks like. So we'll talk a little bit about how tenure kind of impacts what the job description might look like. The next question is, when was the last time your chief executive's job description was reviewed or updated to the best of your knowledge? How recently?
With so many of the executive directors being less than 5 years, this answer will be interesting, Lindsey.
Mm-hmm. But also great to see so many people engaging in succession planning with new chief executives.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which surprised me, which is great. Okay, great. So a more even split here. So it looks like, this year and last year, almost half have been fairly recently. And then going farther out within the last 3 to 5 years, 20%, and then 15% unsure. We do get a lot of not sures. Sometimes people really they're not quite sure when it was updated. So at least good to see that there's, more towards the top here and recently being updated.
Yeah. Lindsey, I think the record for a client length of job description was 28 years. A lot can change in an organization.
Yeah. Yep. Great.
Well, thank you for doing the polls. We're going to do a little reminder. Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Lindsey.
Just a quick reminder here. So if you did not either see, receive, or complete the assessment, the succession planning assessment, that there is a hyperlink to that SurveyMonkey assessment that's live that you can go to at any time. And there's a PDF version of the assessment as well in the Dropbox that you can use with your board. So again, this is an assessment that overviews the full succession planning process and helps you gauge where your organization is in that process. So be sure to take that if you have not.
And any questions about that, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. So we're going to do a quick level set here because we know some of you didn't participate in the first forum. So we wanted to do just a quick overview. The theme of this 5-part forum series is succession planning. So really quickly, succession planning is an extension of strategic planning, and it is a board responsibility. We will hear from executive directors all the time and who say, well, the board told me I have to put together my succession plan. Number 2, succession planning is not synonymous with executive transition and search. We will, hear fear and trepidation from executive directors who say, but I'm not ready to retire. So it's too early to do succession planning, but it is not the same as search. Number 3, succession planning is best accomplished when leadership is stable, when the organization is not yet in a transition or in an active search process. So again, with so many of you saying your executive director has been within 5 years, that's outstanding. Now is the time to plan. And then ultimately, number 4, not all departures are planned, which is why we always talk about emergency preparedness. And so the first forum, which was all about emergency preparedness, as Danielle said, has been recorded in the Dropbox. So please feel free to go back and look at that if you missed that session. So these are some succession planning scenarios, right? So the most common that we think about is an executive director who retires. And often the organization has lots of ample time to think about retirement. There's resignation with advance notice, which can be very happy. Someone who's leaving to take another position at another, a bigger organization and gives ample time for that transition. There's the not so positive resignation with little notice, which, typically does not end happy. There's sabbatical, which can be very positive and have lots of advance notice. There's termination, which is always negative and impacts culture. Leave of absence, this is a different color because of leave of absence can be happy and planned like a maternity leave, or it can be very sad and unexpected like a major health, a massive heart attack of your CEO who now has to take a leave, which certainly isn't planned. And then of course, an executive director who passes away. So just again, a reminder of what the scenarios are that lead to a transition. And then with that, these are some of the transition risks. So we want all of you to look at your policies on a regular basis, and the policies that can trigger a departure are whistleblower protection, conflict of interest, and harassment. Do you have a whistleblower policy? And in that whistleblower policy, is there a statement that says, should an employee want to raise an alarm about whatever scenario, they can go to this person. And there should be multiple people named in the whistleblower. If only the chief executive is named and the whistleblowing incident is related to the chief executive, who does the employee go to? And there's an example of an organization that Lindsey and I know where there was no named person in the whistleblower policy, and the person went to the Columbus Dispatch, right? So you don't want the headline news because no one knew where to go. So whistleblower protection. Conflict of interest. We see this not only at the chief executive level, we can see this at the board level, but do you have a comprehensive conflict of interest policy? And are there measures in there to guard and mitigate risk for the organization? And then harassment. Harassment can be sexual harassment, harassment can be bullying. And the latest thinking on harassment policies is that they should include board members, donors, not just staff, right? So harassment can happen, chief executive to a staff member, it can happen staff member to staff member. But again, the latest thinking is, does your harassment policy include board member to staff member harassment, donor to staff member harassment? Dr. Aaron Beaton at OSU's Glenn College has done groundbreaking research, and then the volume and level of sexual harassment that happens with development directors from donors. And we can put a link to her research in the Dropbox for you. So again, want to make sure that you have this comprehensive lens on policies.
Great. So now we're going to talk about leadership considerations. When thinking about that job description, the executive profile, the attributes, skills, competencies of the chief executive, what are some things to consider? So the first one is that what an organization needed in a leader when their current chief executive was hired very well may not be what that organization needs in a future hire or needs today. So what's happened, what we see here happen quite a bit is that over time, the job of that chief executive sort of morphs into whomever the person is in that role now. As we know, nonprofits, wear lots of hats. So the job can take on many responsibilities that may not have been in that initial job description. And the problem with that is that you then now created a completely different job that you're going to have trouble then filling going forward in the future. We worked with a client that it had been over 10 years since the chief executive had an updated job description. And in that 10-year time frame, they had had an associate director leave. They had taken on the associate director responsibilities. They may have had a skill set that was very strong in one area. So that job became heavy in one particular area due to the skills of that particular individual. Well, now that chief executive job description looks very different than what the job was intended to be, and very different than what you may want to hire for in the future.
That's right.
The second one here is kind of, the opposite. When you're thinking about hiring, the goal is to avoid this massive pendulum swing of hiring the polar opposite individual of the current chief executive, because perhaps the board is overcompensating for some perceived or real gap in skills or weaknesses of that departing chief executive. And I'm sure you all can imagine this. There's a person who's been in this role, and then they want to fill a completely different skill set. So they swing the pendulum completely in the other direction. And we see this sometimes, when you think about there being visionaries and executors of an organization, then those are two, categories of leadership that you hear quite a bit. And sometimes, you may have this wonderful visionary that had maybe challenges executing. So they're going to swing that pendulum all the way to this very, very logistically, fabulous executor. And then the organization loses that vision. So that pendulum swing can be really dangerous. We also see this in terms of, let's say the priorities for an organization have shifted in the sense that they want to bring in more private funding. So then fundraising becomes this hyper focus for an organization. Fundraising may not have been a role that the current chief executive had taken on or been expected to take on to that degree. So then once again, while focusing on one particular set of skills, you kind of lose sight of those other attributes that perhaps have helped with the success of the current executive director. So really careful on that pendulum swing.
Yeah, and Lindsey, I'll add to that. This is very jarring for the staff, right? You know, the staff has worked with a chief executive who had ABC skills, right? Maybe they were the great communicator, but not great in financial management. And then suddenly the board hires the CPA who can't communicate, right? I mean, of course, that's an exaggeration, but it's really, really jarring for the staff. And that transition that happens sometimes doesn't last long. It can be jarring for the board. It can be jarring for donors. But we often see staff struggle when suddenly the new leader is the polar opposite. So keep that in mind as you go through these exercises.
Great. So the third one here is, the skill sets and the competencies required for a chief executive are different than leadership attributes. And here in a slide or two, we'll define the difference between those three. But this is why you need to consider having both a job description and what we think of as a leadership profile. So that job description is going to be, what are those skills? What are the activities of the job at a high level? Where a profile is going to be more those attributes, the competencies, the strengths, the traits of an individual to take on that role. And so, when a description is posted, oftentimes people are going to go to that profile first to say, what are the attributes they're looking for? Before they're looking at kind of like, the activities and the operations, they're going to see, what are those attributes? What are those traits that they're looking for in this job? So it's really important to have this high level profile that's a part of the job description as well. And also important to remember that the job description is high level, right? It's, even though it's activities, we're not getting into the weeds where maybe if you had more of an entry level position, it would be quite detailed in what those activities are. At a chief executive level, those activities are still high level, although they're different than the attributes and competencies.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll add an example here. There's an organization that we've worked with in the past, and the new hire that came in several years ago didn't work out. And, one of the stakeholders said to me, but she had all the skills, right? Like, she interviewed so well and she had all the skills, but ultimately it was those leadership attributes that did not mesh with the organization. Yes, she had the skills. She could read the job description and say, I can do all of those things. But it was really the leadership attributes that broke that dynamic and that relationship. So yes, totally agree with Lindsey, how important it is to think about both.
And it's also important, again, to be updated, for a couple of reasons here. First, you can't throw everything into a job description, right? So if that client we had that hadn't updated it in 10 years had perhaps done so, they would have seen that they had been putting an unrealistic amount of things onto the chief executive's plate. There were too many things embedded into that job description once it was updated. So it's also a good check when you're updating it to see, does this make sense? Is this realistic? And is this job description, has it been morphed to the individual in place now? Sometimes what an organization will do is say, well, we have needs in these various areas of the organization, so we're gonna pile that all into the same job description. Well, that might make sense for one individual, but those skill sets could be quite different and not make sense for a future hire. So really important to keep it updated to ensure that you have a check on those expectations too.
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing to that as well. Remember, when a search does happen, the departing chief executive is no longer a part of the search, right? The board is leading the search. And so if the job description is outdated, if there never was a leadership profile created, and if the board has a perception of the skills and the attributes needed to hire, and if that perception is different from the reality, then you end up with that failed search, and you end up with someone who was not a good hire, and it wasn't the fault of that person. But remember, For all of you on this webinar who are the executive directors, if you are the chief executives, remember this is about building board capacity because you won't be leading the search when you depart.
So number 4, performance reviews of the chief executive, which should be using the job description as a basis, and board self-assessments should happen annually for feedback. They help maintain communication, they gain insights, they deepen the understanding. It's even what Kerri was just saying in terms of the board understanding the role. These are all important components of that. When you go to do an annual review of the chief executive, that job description should be pulled out as a baseline for what they're being reviewed on. So make sure, that that's updated. And again, it's a good check on if it's realistic. If your chief executive is only able to do a couple of things of all the things that they're being expected to, it's a good time to ask why. Are the expectations unrealistic? What might those issues be that they aren't able to meet all of the expectations in the job description? And then in terms of a board, self-assessment, why a lot of chief executives leave is because of that relationship with the board, which we touched on last time too. So if you want to prevent that, you want to be sure that you're annually assessing what does that partnership look like with the CEO? Is it constructive between the board and the CEO? And making sure that the communication lines and the culture and all of that within the board is positive to help prevent a situation where your chief executive is leaving. And then, of course, you're triggering a search.
Organizations have to allow time for critical conversations, right?
And if you remember too, of all the roles and responsibilities of the board, the third role and responsibility is to support the chief executive. And you use the board assessments to ensure that that's happening.
That's right. That's right.
So a couple of definitions, because when we talk about this with clients, they do start to all sound the same: skills, attributes, traits, competencies, but they are quite different, and they should be thought of as 3 separate categories here. So first is the skills. That's really that ability to perform specific tasks. So skills could be budgeting, active listening. Skills, I tend to think about the things that you can strengthen more easily, you can work on, you can enhance your ability to perform those tasks through the skills. Attributes, on the other hand, are more personal traits or qualities. Our team recently did a strength finder, right? So you naturally have empathy, integrity, or whatever it might be. Those are really embedded into who the person is. So those attributes are more the traits, the qualities, the characteristics of the individual. And then competencies are knowledge, behaviors, attitudes, skills that kind of lead to your ability to do something successfully. The competencies might be the hardest to define in words, but if you think of it this way, a competency might be, business decision-making or business acumen. And then the skills that support that competency would be budgeting, right? So the competency is a little bit broader than the skills themselves, but they're not necessarily a personal trait or characteristic either.
Yeah, and I think so many times when there is a transition and an organization is thinking about the next leader, that focus on skills only can often be to the detriment of the organization. And so that's why, as we continue to go through this webinar today, we'll be talking about competencies and attributes. And we want you all to be thinking at that level, one, to avoid the pendulum swing that Lindsey was talking about, but also to ensure that you are hiring for what the organization needs and not just for skill set. So let's dive into what those core competencies are. So these are from BoardSource. And so we will have a PDF of this BoardSource document in the Dropbox for you as well. So the first core competency, and these are the core competencies of an executive director, right? Of a chief executive, any nonprofit organization, any size, again, according to BoardSource. So the first is fundraising, right? The chief executive, in partnership with the board and the staff, is responsible for raising the dollars, right? Implementing fundraising systems, ensuring that the organization has the dollars needed to carry out the programs and services. Now, it doesn't mean that the board doesn't play a role in fundraising. It doesn't mean that the organization doesn't have a development director. But when you think about a chief executive of a nonprofit, there has to be some acumen. There has to be some understanding of fundraising. the executive director doesn't have to be the one who's actually getting the letters out, but the executive director has to understand donor relations, right? Communicating, engaging, and stewarding donors, has to be willing to make an ask, right? These are competencies that, again, regardless of the size of the nonprofit, the executive director has to really understand, has to know how to do it in partnership, has to understand it at a high level theoretically, and has to be willing to do it. So fundraising. The next one is planning. And this is one that comes up all the time with our clients. An executive director who has the ability to look to the future, right? To work with the board, to have this shared vision for the future. Where is the organization going? Building an understanding around mission, vision, values. Then, okay, now here's the strategic direction of the organization. And the board plays a very important role in charting the direction of the organization. Lindsey mentioned the number 3 role and responsibility of the board is supporting and evaluating the chief executive. The number 1 role and responsibility of a board is mission, direction, strategic direction of the organization. So the chief executive and the board have to be able to ideate, right? Have to be able to see a future. The board helps chart that direction, but then the executive director has to execute, right? He or she has to lead the staff in how the organization is going to get there. So planning and how you're going to execute on that mission, vision, and values. The next one is administration, right? And this might sound kind of basic, but really fundamentally, it's the day-to-day operations of the organization. Does the organization have the proper systems, procedures, policies, practices, people to operate on a day-to-day basis? And I know all of you on here can think of an example of an organization where they failed at this. They failed at daily operations. And this can happen too, where if the chief executive is really strong in that future vision and planning, but is not a great executor, and they don't have a COO or they don't have a chief program officer to do the day-to-day management, there can be a massive disconnect. So the effective operation of an organization, one, again, that has established policies, practices, procedures, processes, that meets its budget, and that ultimately builds donor confidence that yes, this organization said they're going to do A, B, and C, and I have full trust that they will do A, B, and C, and not only do them, but do them well. So good administrative competencies.
Kerri, just real quickly, I feel like that one can be kind of tricky or confusing in a sense that it doesn't necessarily mean you want the chief executive on the ground doing all of that work, right? But they built the systems, they've hired the right people that all of the operations run smoothly. But we've also seen the chief executives, they're, out there with the kids and they're doing all of the really, really tedious administrative work, which is also not their role. So I think it's just important to clarify that they have a responsibility for the operations and maintaining it, but doesn't necessarily mean they're on the ground doing it.
Totally agree. In fact, that makes me think of an example of a former client. She was a first-time executive director. So, that's being a first-time executive director is hard. Lindsey and I have both been in those roles, but she was really uncomfortable at some of those executive roles and kept kind of retreating to her comfort zone of kind of in the nitty-gritty and making sure the name tags were out and getting the letters out. She had such a hard time elevating out, and so it was a big coachable moment for her. But Lindsey's exactly right. You have to have the acumen to ensure the organization's operating well, but you can't live there. And for board members who are on this webinar, if your executive director is living there, there's some coaching, right? There's some support that may be needed. So speaking of the board relations, this is absolutely fundamental. And we've had more than one chief executive say to us, I love everything about my job except the board, or, I can manage the organization, but I can't also manage the board. And there can be kind of a disdain. We had one who was a very dominant chief executive say, I built this board, I'll do with them what I want. And it was like, holy cow, dude, really? Right? So, this is about relationship. This is about constructive partnership. And executive directors have to have time spent building relationships with the board, not about, factions of the board or, who's with me and who's against me, kind of that survivor mentality. No, this is about, together collectively building upon the strengths of both, working in constructive partnership with one another, realizing and understanding the joint responsibility that exists, paying attention to and observing the lanes, right? What is the role of the chief executive versus what is the role of the board? Sharing information, but truly working in partnership. It's just absolutely fundamental. And, that example Lindsey gave of, focusing on the day-to-day, sometimes executive directors aren't sure how to do this board relations part. And so that's another reason why they can focus on it, admin. But the board is your job, right? Every executive director who is on this webinar, you have to have time spent in relationship with the board. And not just an executive committee, the full board. The next one is communications and public relations. So, the chief executive is the primary spokesperson. They're the face of the organization. They're the embodiment of the organization. You have to be able to promote the organization, advocate for the organization, build relationships with constituents, to communicate, why is this organization important? What is the impact that the organization is having in the community? What is the deep need that this organization is solving for? And so your chief executive has to be able to do this well. Again, they become the embodiment of the organization. Sometimes there's skill development needed here for this core competency, which is totally fine. But we have to remember how important it is for the chief executive to be the primary spokesperson. Financial management, right? Dollars and cents. Chief executives have to understand the profit and loss statement. They have to read a balance sheet. They have to understand an audit, right? They have to have sound financial management practices. The budget has to be, clearly articulated. Every assumption in the budget should be noted. There should be forecasts happening, halfway through the fiscal year. Our internal controls in place to mitigate risk. Ultimately, a chief executive is responsible for protecting the organization's assets. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't a chief financial officer or a controller or a bookkeeper, who's doing the day-to-day accounting, like the example Lindsey gave with admin. But it does mean that the chief executive has to understand the budgeting process, has to be able to monitor the financial current state of the organization, and have the ability to project and forecast and say, okay, here's where we are, here's where I think we're going financially, here's where we can pivot, here are some expenses we can cut, or here's additional revenue that we can realize. So we're going to give you another poll here. So as you think about these 6 core competencies: planning, fundraising, administration, board relations, communications and PR, and financial management, I want you to think about your organization and which of these is the highest priority for your organization. So we'll have the poll come up. And all 6 are critical, right? All 6 have to happen, but I want you to think about what's the highest priority for your organization right now. Planning and fundraising. So fundraising took the lead slightly over planning. That's not surprising. We see that a lot. I do see admin was the lowest and board relations was really low. So I hope that means that you've got some really strong board relations. I will assume communications and PR and financial management are lower for your organization because you might have really talented staff in those areas, which is great. So this is important to think about when the time comes for an executive transition in your organization. You know, which of these 6 will be the highest priority? Thanks for doing the poll. And again, all 6 are critical. And as we just mentioned, depending on current state, depending on life cycle, depending on the strengths of your leadership team and other staff supports, these priorities will change over time. So
Yeah.
how you answered that poll now may be different. Go ahead, Lindsey.
No, sorry, I was just going to say that we go through this with all of our succession planning clients, and we ask every stakeholder involved that same question and have them rank it. And it's always the most challenging because they're stuck on the fact that they're all critical. And so I think if it's a helpful frame when considering it, it's, you know, as Kerri alluded to, where do you already have strong staff leadership support? Do you have a really effective CFO that handles that financial management? Has your development director been there for a while and has great relationships on the fundraising side? So I think it's, again, it's the current state, who's there to support. And we even had a client once answer it. They initially answered it and said, oh, I answered it as if an organization were brand new and where I would start with them. But then if you say, well, where are we today? My answers would be completely different. So all just to say that the priorities will change as the organization evolves.
That's right. So let's talk more about leadership attributes, and I'll turn it over to Lindsey.
Yeah, so back to attributes. So again, those traits, you know, qualities, characteristics. We have a listing here that's adapted from Forbes, which just lists, I mean, there's a handful, right? Nobody's all of the attributes, but some, you know, accountable, adaptable, agile, curious, empathic, energetic, humble, motivator, resilient, self-aware, solutions-oriented, talent developer, values-driven, and visionary. So, you know, all wonderful things, all, you know, can help make a strong leader. But, you know, I think it's important to think, one, you know, where does your organization prioritize these? And a question that we like to ask organizations too is, don't think about the individual, but if you had to give your organization a characteristic or a trait, what would it be? And it's super interesting to see what they say, how they would define the character of their organization, and then the character of their chief executive, because oftentimes they're very, very similar, right? So, you know, and in that chief executive with attributes that are effective and positive, you know, they really can create a culture based around that. So important to think about, you know, what are the attributes that are important to your organization? How does that show up in your next leader?
And I think I'll just add, you know, Lindsey shared the example where we ask clients this question. It's an interesting exercise. Do it at your next board meeting, right? What do you think the personality or characteristics of this organization are, right? And see what words come up. We worked with an advocacy organization, and, you know, one of their attributes was like being a bulldog. They were really strong in that protect and advocate for the population that they served. And again, that'll be a very different attribute and trait than another organization.
Mm-hmm. And also look to see how they align with your organization's values too. I think that's important, right? You know, organizations may value curiosity and all of these things. So you want to ensure, it would be very confusing for a new person to come in and see your organization's values are one thing, but the attributes that you're looking for are something different. So make sure to look at how they align there too.
Yep.
So a quote that's come out of our work here is, it's always important to be looking for the skills you can't teach and then teach the ones you can. There's a form of cultural competency that's hard to teach. So again, this is, you know, when you get really super skills focused, you may be going down, you know, a dangerous path in the sense that there are things you can teach and then there are things that you can't teach. And so this person was saying, I always start with the attributes because those things are embedded into who the person is, and the skills you can work to strengthen. And again, when you think about, if anyone's familiar with like the Strengths Finder, you start with where the person's strengths are and leverage those, as opposed to starting at the bottom where they're not as strong and trying to bring those up, because that's wasted energy where you could be focusing on the strength. So just an interesting perspective here on how skills play into it, and maybe shifting that focus more towards attributes. Here, you know, when you look at your job description, reviewing it, a couple things to keep in mind. An updated chief executive job description should include the following things. It should include, again, core competencies and leadership attributes in addition to skills required. It should be high level and strategic. It's not in the weeds. You're not going into the day-to-day, things that every chief executive is going to do. It's still high level while describing the activities that are expected. It should communicate your organization's mission, vision, and values. So again, and those values should align with the attributes of the individual. And it should be accurate, it should be realistic, and it should be compelling. And so accurate, again, if it's too compelling and it's not accurate, that's not right. But being sure that it's all three. It's accurately defining the job. It has realistic expectations for what they will come into, but it's also compelling and shows all the interesting work that will be done.
And when it's not realistic, it's just so difficult, right? When it's when you're asking someone to come in and be, Superman or Wonder Woman or whatever, right? Like we need you to do this, this, and this, and be an expert in this, and be like, oh my gosh, right? I mean, that is just setting the next higher up, setting the current chief executive and the future chief executive up for failure. It's really challenging. So I completely agree with Lindsey about being realistic and what fundamentally do you need?
It would be an interesting next poll question, Kerri, to see all of those newer chief executives on the call, over half, right? And all the people that have updated job descriptions, how accurate, was that job description when they took on this role within the last 5 years? So I'd love to see how those aligned.
Oh, so when we get to Q&A, or if anyone wants to put that in the chat, I think that's great. Yep, all you new chief executives, how accurate was it? That's a great question.
So then in terms of relationship building, this is a focus for all chief executives, especially in the nonprofit space. So helping them by determining which relationships are highest priority really gives the chief executive guidance to ensure that they're spending their time in accordance with what the board expects and what the organization needs. And, this sort of reminds me of ranking the core competencies. All relationships are important, so we know that, right? But then how do we prioritize them? So first, it's a good exercise for the board to do. And we have all of our succession planning clients answer this question. But again, perhaps there is someone who already manages your program partnerships wonderfully. So the chief executive can have less focus there. Or perhaps your development director has been in place for a long time and a fabulous fundraiser. Well, then maybe that takes some of the heat off of the chief executive to focus on those relationships. So again, assessing where the organization is in current state on the relationship side, and then how does that help you determine the priorities that the chief executive should be focusing on there?
Yeah, that's right. And I'll give a quick example. We were working with a new chief executive, and the board said to him, we want you out in the community. Right. We want you, meeting, meeting and greeting, right? Go out for coffee, lunch. We want you to meet all these stakeholders. And so the new chief executive did that because that's what the board said. Well, at the end of the day, it was to his detriment because it was an overemphasis on external relationships, and the internal relationships, primarily the staff, and some of the volunteers, but primarily the staff, are like, what the heck? The guy's never here. Why hasn't he met with us yet? And so, there has to be a balance, of course, of internal and external, but getting really clear on those priority relationships, that board did a disservice to that director. Those internal relationships were really needed. And I will tell you one of the reasons why. That chief executive succeeded a founder chief executive. And so that founder had been there for a long time. And those internal relationships, primarily the staff, had a lot of fear and trepidation about this leadership transition. And then suddenly the guy's out, meeting and greeting all the time. So please remember that as well.
And real quickly, Kerri, before we move off attributes, one thing that we hear about a lot too in thinking about a search is, especially when you have an executive director who's been there a long time, there's sort of this balance between, are we looking for a content expert in whatever area your organization serves? Are we looking to replace all the content knowledge that the existing individual has? Are we looking for someone who's licensed in a particular thing to be the next chief executive? Versus, are we really going to go out with attributes first? Are we going to focus on the attributes needed? And maybe the licensure is not top priority. So, in an ideal world, you have a balance of it all, but I think you're going to come to a crossroads where there's this content expertise versus attributes. And that's a discussion that's also really interesting to have because people have strong opinions on it. But we are seeing more and more that licensure expertise is not always needed or the top priority for a chief executive in the nonprofit space. And that those attributes are really going to lead to success. So interesting to think about there. And, another thing that we have seen and heard from too is that, in a for-profit world, it might be different, right? So in a for-profit world, you're looking for an attorney who is an expert in this kind of law, and that is going to take precedent over anything else. But in this nonprofit world where the chief executive has maybe a wider spectrum of responsibility, maybe it's not the expertise and it's the attributes.
Yeah. Oh, completely agree. Completely agree. So we'll go to closing because we want to make sure we have time for Q&A. And so we wanted to share this quote. And this was in relation to a succession planning client. And their answer to one of Lindsey's questions was, what is important is mission over ego. And, when Lindsey and I were planning this session today, I shared the example of the executive director that did not work out. And the person said to me, but she had all the skills. Ultimately in that instance, what Lindsey and I experienced was ego over mission. And this person was just such a, driven by her personal status, her personal success, making her look good. And frankly, the mission took a back seat, was secondary. And so as you're thinking about what does the organization need, and you're thinking about these profiles and attributes, we also wanted to share this quote with you because you really, in this social sector that we all work in, when all of you are trying to meet the community's deep needs and solve for the challenges and the complexities of poverty and education and human services, and health, and all of the missions that you support. Ultimately, when you think about your next chief executive, we want you to think about making sure you're thinking about someone who will put mission over ego at all times. So we'll go to the Q&A time, and we'll invite Danielle back to help facilitate this conversation.
Thank you very much for that. I know that this is about chief executive core competencies, but there were a lot of great nuggets in here around just a good construction of a good job description and preparation around hiring in general, that I think many of our participants today could take away from that conversation. So thank you for that. The other thing that I took away from this as well was that, when you're looking to hire a new chief executive or prepare for that replacement, you're not looking for a carbon copy and you're not looking for a polar opposite. It's really about being aware and flexible to who your organization is in the moment that you're making that hire. And I think that's an excellent call out. So folks in our audience today, this is the time to put your questions in the Q&A box. As those come to you, feel free to upvote questions as you see them. But I want to start off today with a question around when a board has not performed a performance review in many years. As a leader, as an executive director, how do you pursue that? What should you do?
It's a great question. And it actually reminds me, we were facilitating a board retreat and we touched on this because, as Lindsey said, supporting and evaluating your chief executive is the number 3 role and responsibility. And when we got to that one, a board member said to the chief executive, "We've done that, right?" And the chief executive's answer was, "My performance review was a text message that I got from the board chair who said, 'We all think you're doing a great job.'" And so there was a real moment of board members saying like, "Oh." So if you, and to your question, Danielle, if you are not receiving a proper performance review, number 1, you can share the board source top 10 roles and responsibilities that show how important this is. And number 2, I think you have to just have the conversation that says, constructive feedback, right, is really helpful to me. I would like to have the opportunity to talk about my work. I'd like to have the opportunity to talk about the board's work. And so that we make sure we're all on the same page. We are all professionals. We all need feedback to do our job. And so I would encourage any chief executive to use those board source top 10 roles and responsibilities to help get the conversation started. And Danielle, I'll add one more thing for board members who are on the webinar. Every single board member should participate in the performance review of the chief executive. And then 2 or 3 board members should meet with that chief executive to share the results. Please do not just have the executive committee members do the performance review. Please don't just have the board chair sit down with the executive director. It should be the full board and then several board members meeting with him or her, not just one-on-one.
So, sorry, go ahead, Lindsey.
Just to quickly say, I think sometimes the hesitation is, well, we don't have a performance review written, we don't have it drafted. There's a hurdle there. It's the time to create one. So Board Source does have great samples, and they have a very thorough chief executive assessment, and it even allows for the first section to be edited for the job description of that particular individual at that organization. So there are resources that will give you question by question if that is the hurdle.
Thank you for saying that, because that was actually one of my 2 follow-up questions, because I do believe that lack of time and ambiguity working together are a recipe for just procrastination. So having that template will be very helpful for folks. My other question here was, I was wondering if you could really reiterate for us the importance of having that leadership performance evaluation in the conversation around succession planning. How are those 2 linked?
Yeah. So Board Source has data that proves boards who regularly self-assess themselves, which means, so say I'm a board member, me, Kerri, I'm going to assess how we as a board, as a collective entity function. We're going to look at the board culture, the board work, the board composition, right? All of the things. The data is when a board regularly participates in a structured self-assessment process, those organizations are operating at a higher level. They are achieving greater mission impact. They're raising more money, right? They are just operating so much better. And the reason it's linked to this whole conversation about chief executive succession and leadership, the leadership of tomorrow is, I'll go back to something Lindsey said. Many times chief executives are leaving their roles because of the board, right? The board is not doing X, or there's factions on the board, or the relationship between that chief executive and the board is broken. It's fractured in some way. There's some dysfunction. There's a level of mistrust has been created. The culture has gone negative. And so when a board is not regularly self-assessing, they're not giving themselves that time for that reflective practice of how are we as a collective entity doing? What is our relationship with the chief executive? And what can we course correct or fix or adjust to ensure that those relationships stay trusted, collegial, respected, and that your chief executive stays in the role longer than departing out of frustration?
So you mentioned board self-assessments, and you also mentioned performance evaluations of the leader. And so what I believe I'm understanding from you, and I want you to check my understanding here, is that the board self-assessment works together with the CEO's performance evaluation to enlighten the development of a job description for a leader. Is that correct?
Yeah, so pick 1 month out of the year. So say it's April, right? Every April, the board will assess itself, a board self-assessment. And then every April, the board will do a performance review of the chief executive. Mm-hmm. And have those conversations, look at the job description. The performance review of the chief executive should be based on the job description. And then you can have those conversations over, what do we need to adjust? What's working well, what's not working well. And then once that's done at the leadership level, then the chief executive can then do performance reviews of the rest of the staff. But the reason we suggest pick 1 month out of the year to do that is then you can operationalize it, right? And then it just becomes norm. Danielle, you mentioned, ambiguity creates procrastination, right? So pick a month, call it, performance review month or assessment month. Start with the top down.
I love that because building in those routines really does help a board feel more secure in their roles and responsibilities. So we have one question. It came through in the chat and I was able to catch it. It says, how much should the chief executive officer be involved in a board assessment process? And I want to add to this a little bit because you mentioned the relationship between the chief executive and the board being important. What does feedback between those two entities look like?
So absolutely, yes, a chief executive needs to participate in that board self-assessment. So for instance, we'll pretend I'm a board member, me, Kerri, I'm going to review how we are doing as a board, as a collective entity. Say Lindsey's the executive director. Lindsey then has to look at, okay, how do I, as the chief executive, how do I think the board is doing as a collective entity? And then you can compare those answers, right? If the board's perception is we're really great on A, B, and C, but then, Lindsey's perspective is actually, I think B is an area of weakness, and I think you guys are doing better on D. So yes, you absolutely want the chief executive to participate in that, compare those answers, and use that for conversation.
All right, so we have another question in the Q&A. It says that we mentioned a Dropbox link. Yes, so you will be receiving a link to a Dropbox after the duration of this forum. It comes in an email that you use to register for the forum, and it will include the slide deck for this forum and a recording. We also received another question that landed in the chat. I just want to make a little reminder to add your content related questions to the Q&A box. It gets a little jumbled for me if they're in the chat, but this one said that one of the attributes listed for chief executive was being self-aware. And what is a good way for that to be developed in a role?
Yeah, which is super interesting. Kerri and I were just talking about this yesterday. We'll have to pull up the article, but Harvard Business Review actually just did a thing around effective leaders and their competency to confidence ratio. And the most effective leaders are more competent than they are confident. And then the flip, right? So there's this overconfidence, which in my opinion is a lack of self-awareness in many cases, right? Versus the competency of what they're actually doing. And so the most ineffective leaders the ratio is much stronger on the confidence over the competence. So I think to what we were just saying, assessments and evaluations are a great way to bring reality to the chief executive, to bring some self-awareness, right? Self-awareness is a hard thing to develop in someone. However, if you're presenting them with information, assessments, performance reviews, that's hard data to ignore and perhaps can put in perspective what their competence is versus what their confidence is, and kind of address that self-awareness issue.
Yeah. And, these aren't easy conversations, right? It's, for a chief executive, you are very vulnerable because the board hires and fires you, right? So for a chief executive to say to a board, we need to talk about culture, or we need to talk about power dynamics, or we need to talk about communication, that makes the chief executive feel very vulnerable. And I will tell you, and Board Source has this data as well, that many chief executives on a regular basis feel like they are under the microscope. They feel like every board meeting is a mini performance review. So we have to acknowledge how vulnerable chief executives feel. We have to understand that these are difficult conversations, but we also have to realize that if we go back to that quote about mission over ego, if we go back to fundamentally, We are all working in this organization because we are trying to, right, whatever your mission is, fill in the blank. So if we put mission first and not ego first, then you can say, okay, we all want the right thing for the community. We all want mission fulfillment. So let's talk about areas of opportunity. Let's talk about areas for growth, and let's do it in a very respected and collegial way. Which, Danielle, I will say, is also why we want to further emphasize the performance review should come from every board member, because what can happen are these power dynamics or personality conflicts. And if the one board member who doesn't like the chief executive is the only one who participates in the survey, or what I'm getting at. So it has to be collegial, respected. There has to be a level of candor and honesty, but it's really hard to have that if there's an underlying culture that is not trusted and collegial.
I think we could probably do an entire forum on developing self-awareness and what confidence and competence look like in a role, and what the complexities are of the expression of those two things in a key leadership position. But it is true that is a very complex concept. And so it's difficult to lay it out that it should look a certain way in every single position. It depends on the relationships that exist and overlap for that leader and many other factors. So I have another question here for you. You talked a lot about designing leadership profiles during this forum, and that is a distinctly different list of characteristics than we have for skill sets or competencies. And so I find that the leadership profile piece is often taken for granted in the design of a job description, and that organizations will list all or none or everything under the sun. But I am wondering if you could get into more depth around how an organization truly knows what its key leadership profiles are. How should that look as far as in that annual reassessment or re-understanding of the organization? How should a nonprofit really say, we do care about a leader that is agile, but that's not something that really we express in our organization. We care more about, a people person or something like that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kerri, you can start and I'll jump in.
Okay. I think there has to be time for reflective practice, right? And so that question of, to your point, Danielle, is being agile really getting to the heart of helping us achieve our mission? Or is, empathy, or is assertiveness, or is advocacy? Or so I think mission has to be at the core of this. And that example that I gave of our former client that was an advocacy organization, they were literally, their charter was to protect and advocate. Nurturing is not, necessarily at their core. Being assertive, being willing to do a class action lawsuit on behalf of the people that they serve, that is at their core. So I think the reflective practice has to be about our mission. What is it that we are trying to achieve in the world? What is our purpose? And then what are the traits that we would need to help us meet the needs of the people and places that we serve from a mission fulfillment standpoint? Would be my first reaction, but I'll let Lindsey jump in too.
No, I think that's right. And I think this is the hardest part. Those attributes are the hardest. I think of an interview process. Skills are one thing, but understanding if someone's truly empathic is another, right? And so, first, I certainly would go through the exercise of having the board and stakeholders identify what they think those attributes are. But, we even had in one of our clients, they said something along the lines of like, you can't quantify or you can't tangibly capture how our leader makes people feel. And like, I mean, it was a beautiful statement, but it was basically like, how are we ever going to put that in a box and try to find someone who makes you feel it? Because it's a feeling. It's a way they make you feel. It's a way they build relationships. And so just to state that it is hard, it is very hard in a process to get to the attributes. But I think it's important to understand what you're looking for, as Kerri noted, and we've gone through how you can do that. But then also it's really important for the individuals, the candidates, to what are their personal values? How do they show those values in their work, in their everyday life? You know, if being adaptable and flexible is a value, well, then they should certainly be able to speak to how they've done that and how they show that. And so I think really getting at the heart of the values of the individuals is going to help with making sure you can capture some of those attributes.
Yeah, and when you call references, do you add in a question of how does this person make you feel? Lindsey is exactly right. We're doing 2 succession plans right now. And that question when we're doing these interviews has been fascinating. I mean, these 2 chief executives make people feel seen. They make them feel heard. They are very much, they are the kind of that quintessential servant leader. And that really meets the needs of those organizations. And so for that board to have that level of awareness is really, really critical.
If I can just add to that, I think you've done an excellent job of articulating that, but also in a job description that you're planning to distribute, being really clear. Don't add everything that you can possibly think of that you might possibly one day want to see in a leader, because then it gives your candidates an opportunity to self-select. I fit this profile or I do not fit this profile. That's so that when it comes down to time for you to interview, you will hopefully have candidates who have said, I know that I possess these skills. So being really clear about what those attributes are important. Totally. So I have another question for you regarding the concept of fit. I'm going to call it, these are my words, but fit for hire versus fit for growth. And I know a lot of a hire for fit versus hire for growth. So a lot of organizations are looking to attributes to help them and the feeling of an interview that they get to help them determine whether their leader is a cultural fit. And that may be a great key for who they are today, but may not be where they're going. It also may not be the fit that they need to challenge their organization for growth. And it also may weed out leaders who might not feel like the fit, but are the fit. So can you talk a little bit about how we balance this need to get at attributes, the leadership profile, with the need to see the organization for its future? Does that question make sense?
Totally. I think it's a great question. So the theme of this is leadership for tomorrow, right? And so we would want the board in that reflective practice to be thinking about tomorrow and a little bit less about current state for today. We all just celebrated the 3-year anniversary of the start of the pandemic and the shutdown. 3 years and 2 months ago, none of us would have predicted where we are today. So when a board is just thinking about current fit today, they're kind of losing the perspective that your chief executive has to have an eye to the future, has to help move the organization forward. So we wouldn't want them to limit just about current state today. We want them to have more of an open mind for what's coming, what's coming and where does this organization need to go? And, Danielle, you mentioned about growth. I think a board defining what growth means to them is really, really important. Growth could mean expansion into other communities, right? You're going to now serve more counties or more states or whatever it is. Growth could mean just more people in the current community that you serve, more locations and like in a smaller region. Growth can mean going deeper with the same people that you serve, but you're now going to add additional programs and services. So for a board to really think about tomorrow, not just today, and what does growth mean for us is so important, because I'll give you another example. We had a client, the chief executive was in her role for 18 months. When she was hired, she was told, take the organization to the next level. So she kept doing all the things that she thought would take the organization to the next level. But there was all this inherent conflict with board members. What is she doing? This doesn't fit who we are today. What's happening? So, we had to come in and we asked every board member, how do you define taking the organization to the next level? We had 20 different definitions that suddenly the board felt like this isn't a fit for who we are today. And then nobody had a common definition of what is that fit for growth of where the organization needs to go tomorrow.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in the succession planning we're working on, that's one of the first things stakeholders will say is they want someone who can be proactive in thinking about how to adapt to the future growth of Columbus, whatever it might be in their sector. And so the person's ability to do that is a priority. But Kerri's right, you have to identify what that is. But then also I think it's really important in all of our work, we always like to think about what are the external impacts, those factors outside of the control of the organization that are going to impact whatever you're trying to do, whether you're trying to, do a fundraising campaign or you're going to hire a candidate. What are those factors that could impact the performance or the success of an individual? And so, if they don't have that ability to be adaptable, or if they don't, and that the community is going to double in size, right? So what are those external impacts? And then how does that play a role in who you're looking for? And trying to think about that a little bit proactively.
Yeah, and Danielle, one more thing, the fit for growth. We all know Columbus is growing, right? Morpsey just changed their projection. It's now, I think, 3.2 million people in the next 20 years. Growth is happening, changes are happening. Those, as Lindsey said, those external factors. We will have to teach more children. We will need to care for more elderly. There's going to be more families who have, a need for access to not only food pantries, but to theaters, right? So those external factors are coming at all of us in this community who operate in this sector, and it's coming fast.
And last thing, such a good question, Danielle. See, we can't stop. We've also, we'll hear, okay, well, what if we bring someone new into this role who's not from the community and they don't have any relationships, right? And the community's growing and they're gonna have to build all these new relationships. And at one point in one of our clients' conversations, the person said, if you pick the right person with the right attributes, the relationship building will come, right? So you can overcome some of those external factors. You can overcome some of the existing relationships or skills or whatever it is, if you pick the right person with the right attributes. So also just, again, trying to continue to rise above and see what are those real attributes that are going to lead to success.
I think that you've highlighted across this forum the importance of planning in advance, because essentially what you've outlined is really, I'm going to call it a SWOT analysis prior to developing your job description, knowing what your external weaknesses and threats are prior to putting together what this role should look like. Considerable amount of advanced planning. The other thing I feel like I hear is that across the community is the concept of being ready for growth. Very vague, just ready for growth. And I think what you've articulated here is that you need to have a working definition of what that means to your organization, because growth is uncomfortable by its nature. And so when you are onboarding, bringing on a new leader and saying, we want to see growth, and that leader takes off with that, you set them up for success. They know exactly what you expect. They will deliver upon that, and you can be ready for the results of that in the moment.
It's a fabulous strategic conversation at the board level too, because you may have, again, like the example I gave, multiple definitions. hash it out, right? I mean, that is a great board conversation to come to some consensus. That's a board meeting that I want to go to, right? So that is a great way to engage the board.
Well, thank you so much for this. This was just session 2, and I know that we have 3 more sessions that we will engage with you on this topic, and I'm looking forward to them. Since this is the end of our forum, I want to remind everyone to please keep an eye out on the inbox that you use to register for this forum. Within a week, you will get to see the recording of this forum and the slides. Additionally, you'll get a link to that Dropbox that contains all of the documents for all 5 sessions. We encourage you to attend all 5 sessions. There's a lot of knowledge that compounds on one another, so we look forward to seeing you there. And with that, please stick around for the survey and have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.